This morning, we are going to finish up a teaching series that we started at the start of this year, where we've been looking at what it means to be fully alive. If you've missed any of the talks, then you might not know this, but we have a podcast you can link to it on our website, and you can pick up any of the talks you may have missed. Or if you're thinking, I can't believe they said that, I need to listen to that again. Whatever it might be, I'd encourage you to do that. And really at the core of this series has been this quote from the first century saint Irenaeus. And he said, "The glory of God is man fully alive." And with this idea that we've been exploring, we've been saying that God is committed to us becoming fully alive in him. And that in some way, our aliveness, our sense of being alive, is somehow bound to God's glory. I don't know how to make full sense of that, but there's this kind of sense that God, when we feel fully alive, when our life is expressed in all its aliveness, it brings glory to God. And now that thought of being fully alive, it didn't originate with St. Irenaeus. And actually Jesus says in John 10:10, he says the thief, meaning the devil or Satan, the thief comes only to steal, kill and destroy. And Jesus said, but I've come that they may have life and life to the full. And as we said repeatedly over this series, to live a life that's full, to live life in its fullest sense, doesn't mean a problem-free life. But actually being fully alive means learning to discover life in the midst of the blessings and the battles. And that actually life is often a series of blessings and battles, isn't it? But it's not like one after the other. It's like at the same time. Has anybody experienced that? You know, it's like the best of times and the worst of times. We likened it to like a train track. You know, on one side of the track, we can see lots of good things going on. And yet at the same time, on the other side of the track, there's loads of pain, loads of suffering. There's adversity. We had dinner with some friends on Friday, and we was talking about it. It's like the glory and the gory. You know, that sometimes that life is full of goodness, but there's problems as well. And so you may remember we started by talking about this idea of seeing our life through the lens of gauges on a dashboard of a car. You know, we all know how to read different gauges on our dashboard, unless you're my wife. And then she tells me about 6 months later, oh, this light came on. But you know, we all have dashboards in our cars, and we can see when we need to refuel. We have lights that come on that give us certain warnings about things. And actually, we can see our life through that kind of lens as well. And we talked about, you know, how are the physical and emotional and spiritual gauges in your life? Are they empty? Are they half full? Are they full? And how might you begin to refuel your tanks, as it were? And I guess that's what this series has been about. We've been kind of thinking about how do we kind of orientate our lives in such a way that we can begin to refuel ourselves in those different areas of our lives. And so we began by saying becoming fully alive starts with the kind of transformation of our minds. That we're not meant to conform, the scriptures tell us, to the world's way of thinking, but we're to think differently. We're to think differently about who we are and who God is. And then we talked about life being found in the absence of hurry. That in a world that is constantly moving, a world that's constantly on the go. We need to find a way to ruthlessly eliminate hurry from our lives, to slow down and find rest. And then we took that kind of idea of, our minds and our bodies, and we talked about, we built this picture that Dallas Willard calls the anatomy of our soul. Our soul is made up of all these integrated parts that make us a person. And actually the scriptures repeatedly tell us to care for our soul. And then you'll remember we shifted gear a little bit and we talked a little bit about finding life as we take the risk to enter into community, enter into life with others. And we said it wasn't so much about just like signing up to a group, although that's a really good thing to do. But actually, it was bigger than that. It's about entering into this kind of reconciling story that God is in the midst of doing. He's reconciling creation back to himself and humanity back to each other. And we have to take a risk. We have to risk to step in to those kinds of spaces. And then last week, if you was here, Paul was talking about finding life in our work. Something that we spend, what do you say, 1/3 of our time doing? Irrespective of whether you're paid for that or not, that we spend at least 1/3 of our time working. And actually work is important. It counts. It's not a case of like we do the spiritual stuff on a Sunday and we do the boring stuff the rest of the week. But actually work is just as spiritual, just as important. And so to finish it up today, I want to think about what it means to live fruitful lives. That as followers of Jesus, we find that we believe we're called to be men and women who bear fruit, to be fruitful in this life. We're called to be fruitful. Henri Nouwen said, life isn't meant to be useful or successful, but it's meant to be fruitful. And there are two things that every single one of us in this room have in common. The first is we were all born. Can you agree? We were all born. We were all born into this world. And the other thing that we all have in common is that one day we're all going to die. Okay? We're all going to leave this world. And for those of us who follow Jesus, the scriptures tell us that we will have to give an account for what we did with the life that we had. And whilst none of us could prepare for our birth, only your parents could do that. And if you're not sure, ask a teenager how that works. But none of us could prepare for our birth. We were just born. We had nothing to do with it. But once we are born and born into a life, and however long or short that life may be, we all have something to achieve. We all have to find meaning in life. And all of us are accountable for the time that we have. And with that is a calling upon us all to be men and women, I believe, who bear fruit, who are fruitful in this life. But I don't know if you've noticed, there's a little bit of tension on around what it means to be fruitful. A few weeks ago, we talked about eliminating hurry from our lives. And we were essentially saying that fruitfulness comes from what? Doing nothing. Yeah. Fruitfulness comes from, not doing, but being. Simply creating space in our lives to stop and reconnect to Jesus. And so there is this reality that in order to be fruitful, there isn't much that we can do. There isn't a lot that we can do other than be reconnected and continually connected to Him. Jesus puts it this way. He says, I am the vine. You are the branches. If you remain in me, in some translations, says, if you abide in me, if you stay close to me, Jesus says, you will bear much fruit. And then he makes this amazing claim. He says, apart from me, you can do nothing. So fruitfulness isn't about striving, is it? It's not about forcing ourselves to be fruitful. You know, a grapevine doesn't have to try hard to produce grapes. It's just the natural outcome of the vine and the branches being connected. And being connected to Jesus naturally means we bear fruit. But then the Apostle Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 15:10. He says, by the grace of God, I am what I am. And his grace to me was not without its effect. I worked harder than all of them. Yet not I, but the grace of God that was in me. And you see, there's this tension that we are to be fruitful by simply remaining in the vine, by being connected to Jesus. But we also have to do something. We also have to work hard as much as it was possible, as much to the grace of God extended to us. We have to work hard. We have to partner with Jesus in the process of bearing fruit. And so it's with that lens that I want to think about what it means to live fruitful lives. I want us to remember that ultimately fruitfulness isn't just about us as well. You know, sometimes we can just think, well, a fruitful life, yeah, I could have a fruitful life. Sounds like a good deal. I want to be fruitful. But also fruitfulness is tied to our ability to actually reproduce ourselves in others. Yeah, so the fruit of our lives should be reproduced in others around us. It's often said that the fruit of an apple tree isn't an apple, but it's another tree. And so in thinking about fruitfulness, we're also reminded that Jesus calls us to go and make disciples. It's not just be a disciple, but it's be a disciple who then goes and makes disciples. And so the pursuit of fruitfulness is found, yes, in our own lives, you know, in the lives that we live, but it's also found in those that we invest in. You know, have you ever met someone who's, you know, known and followed Jesus all their lives, and maybe they've reached their 80s, their 90s, and they're just these people who are just like so close to Jesus, and they tell you their story, and they talk about the different lives that they've impacted and shaped, and God has used them to interact with, and that's a fruitful life, isn't it? That's a life that's bore fruit, not just in the person themselves, but in those that they've come into contact with. And so some of this has to do with how well we stay connected to Jesus, and some of it has to do with how well we reproduce ourselves in others. And actually, those two things are not mutually exclusive. And so if you've got a Bible, we're going to turn to Mark chapter 4. And we're going to turn to a parable that Jesus tells. If you're unfamiliar with Jesus and parables, you know, Jesus told stories that had meaning and significance. And the idea was, well, some people think it was to make it simpler, but have you noticed that most people got more confused? Okay? More people got confused by Jesus' parables than they understood. We'll look at that in a second. But Jesus tells this parable. And in this parable, he talks about a farmer who goes out to sow seed in a field. And in this parable, Jesus says some of the seed falls on the path, and the birds come and eat it before it could grow. He then says some fall on the rocks where there's not much soil, and it springs up quickly, but because there's no soil, the thing that grows, it withers and dies. And then he says some seed falls amongst thorns, which grow but then are choked and do not grow anymore. But here's what he says in verse 8 of Mark 4. He says, still other seed fell on good soil. It came up, grew, and produced a crop, some multiplying 30, some 60, and some 100 times. And so Jesus talks about this story of a farmer who's sowing seed. And, the seed lands in 3 places that are not so great and lands in one place where it grows and it multiplies. It bears fruit. And as Jesus tells this parable, he says, whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. And the picture we have in this moment is one of Jesus kind of teaching the crowds. And he's teaching the crowds before him. He's kind of telling them this amazing, insightful story. And I don't know how you picture this, but I kind of imagine the disciples who are with Jesus, and they're just like, yeah, Jesus, preach it. They're kind of like, woohoo, Jesus, you've just, that's the best one yet, Jesus. That's the best story you've told so far. And then they get Jesus on his own a little later that day, and they're like, Jesus, that was a great story you told, but what did you mean? What did you mean, Jesus? And so Jesus takes the time to explain it to them. And that's where we're going to pick up verse 13 of Mark 4. And so Jesus says to them, do you understand this parable? Don't you understand this parable? How then will you understand any parable? The farmer sows the word. Some people are like seed along the path where the word is sown, and as soon as they hear it, Satan comes and takes away the word that was sown in them. Others, like seed sown on rocky places, hear the word and at once receive it with joy. But since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. Still others, like seed sown among thorns, hear the word, but the worries of this life, the deceitfulness of wealth, and the desires for other things come in and choke the word, making it unfruitful. Others, like seed sown on good soil, hear the word, accept it, and produce a crop, some 30, some 60, and some 100 times what was sown. And so as we think about what it means to be fruitful, as we continue to acknowledge that it's about our connection to Jesus and our kind of cooperation with him, and as we acknowledge that fruitfulness is not just about us, but it's about how we reproduce ourselves in others, being obedient to go and make disciples. I guess the question that we could start with is what stops us from being fruitful? What stops us from bearing fruit, the kind of fruit that remains and reproduces and yields a crop? And I think this passage gives us a few clues. Jesus says that the seed that lands on the path is where the word is sown, but as soon as they hear it, Satan comes and takes away the word that was sown in them. In Luke's account of this parable, he talks about the seed being taken so that they will not understand. And so one of the things that stops us from bearing fruit, from being fruitful, is a lack of understanding. We can often be unfruitful in our life because we just don't get it. Have we truly understood what Jesus has said to us? What he's invited us into? Do we really understand when Jesus said, go and make disciples, that wasn't an optional extra? It wasn't something reserved for a select few in the room. That all of us are called to be fruitful by reproducing ourselves in other people. Have we really understood that? Have we truly understood the missionary calling of the church? One author puts it this way. He says, the community of God's people exists not for themselves, but for the sake of the world. Mission is therefore not a program or a project some people in the church do from time to time. The church's very nature is to be God's missionary people. Mission is not about a project or a budget or some one-off event somewhere. It's not even about sending missionaries. A missional church is a community of God's people who understand who they are by their very nature. God's missionary people living as a demonstration of what God plans to do in and for all of creation in Jesus Christ. Mic drop. Now, I don't know about you, but that kind of sounds like a big deal, doesn't it? It kind of sounds like a significant calling upon us. Do we really understand that? Do we really understand that that's who we're called to be? Do we really understand our call to go and make disciples? And not just disciples inside here, but disciples out there, among our neighbors, in our workplaces, among our friends, our family. All of us have a sphere of influence where we're to go and make disciples. And sometimes we miss that, don't we? Sometimes we don't understand that. Not only can we lack understanding of what we're called to do, but we can lack understanding of who we really are and the authority that we've been given. And that goes back to understanding our identity, what we said right at the beginning of this series. That the way we think, the way we use our minds, the way we understand God. Kevin Dedman from Bethel, he says this. He says, having a proper revelation of our identity determines the level of kingdom authority we walk in, which will determine the amount of influence we have in bringing the kingdom of God to earth. And sometimes we can lack fruitfulness because we lack understanding. And sometimes we can lack fruitfulness because we don't really understand who we are in Christ. Secondly, we can fail to bear fruit because we lack root. Jesus says, since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble and persecution comes, they quickly fall away. A lack of fruit is often a lack of root, a failure to kind of dig deep. Ironically, it's in times of trouble, isn't it? Those times that we've been talking about, those times of pain, those times of battle, that we often grow the most. But if we've not rooted ourselves in those times, we find ourselves falling away. But when we stand firm in our troubles, when we take root in the hard times, we ironically we bear fruit. We carry fruit in our lives as a result of that. You see, following Jesus isn't living life on a cruise ship. It's actually more like living on a battleship, isn't it? But the problem is that when some of us turned to Jesus, we thought we were getting on a cruise ship. And that kind of sounds exciting, doesn't it? It's like sunning yourself on the deck, drinking pina coladas, or, whatever it might be. But following Jesus is not a cruise ship. The reality is the Christian life is often a battleship. We're at war. There's a battle to be had. There's even blood to be shed. Jesus said, in this life, you're going to have trouble. But take heart, because I have overcome. You see, when trouble comes, when we have those moments of battle and adversity, we lean into something. We take root in the fact that Jesus is the one who's overcome. He's overcome it all. And so a failure to be fruitful can be a result of lack of roots that we've put down. The third reason is that we can fail to bear fruit is due to a lack of focus. What does Jesus say? He says, seed sowed among thorns. But the worries of this life, the deceitfulness of wealth, and the desire for other things come in and choke the word, making it unfruitful. And so often we can come to Jesus and we can understand the implications of that. We can have good roots, but often the thing that stops us being fruitful is just the stuff of life. And so we can all experience that, this tendency to allow the stuff of life to just choke us, to distract us, to lead us down a path that is fruitless. Many of us will know what it's like to be overcome by the things that life can throw our way. And I don't want to belittle that. Things like worry, anxiety, stress, they're all very real emotions that we feel. And they're real emotions that affect the way that fruitfulness is outworked in our lives. They rob us of being fruitful. And so maybe one of those things, or maybe all three, a lack of understanding, a lack of root, or a lack of focus is something we can recognize in our lives. That when we look at our lives and we see the areas of lives that don't seem to be bearing fruit, maybe it's one of those things. Maybe one of those things has got hold of us and is having an impact. Maybe you become frustrated because life, it doesn't seem to work the way it's meant to work right now. I really want my life to bear fruit, but for some reason it's not working. Well, maybe it's because some of the seed that's been sown in your life has been sown in some of those places. And so because of that, not only do we fail to experience a fullness and fruitful life of our own, but we also fail to see fruitfulness outworked in the lives of others. If we're not experiencing that ourselves, there's no way we can give that to others, is it? You can't serve what you're not cooking. And so if we're called to bear fruit, if we're called to bear fruit in others, where do we start? How do we begin? Well, I want to finish by asking you four fairly simple questions that actually only you can answer this morning. You see, when we begin to lean into the answer of these questions, when we begin to live lives like seed that's landed on good soil, I think then we can begin to imagine what a fruitful life might look like. Jesus says in verse 20, the seed sown on good soil is where people who hear the word accept it, and it produces a crop. Some 30, some 60, and some 100 times that which was sown. And so I've just got four questions for you to consider. You might want to close your eyes. You might want to lie on the floor. I don't know. But just 4 questions to consider this morning. The first question is this: what has God already said? When it comes to living a life that bears fruit, what has God already told you to do? What has He already told you to do in order for you to be fruitful? Jesus said he did nothing except what he saw the Father doing. And that's good news for us, because it means God the Father is always at work. Our task is to hear the Father's voice in what he's directing us towards. You see, hearing the Father's voice for Jesus was the thing that sustained his entire life. And so what would it take for you to hear and consider again what God has already said to you, what he's already called you to be fruitful in? And then what would it mean for you to follow his lead in that? You know, so often we can be waiting to hear some big calling from God, can't we? And for him to say, go and do this amazing thing, but be fruitful here. And we neglect that he's already told us, he's already shown us, and maybe some of us need to go back to some of those things and remind ourselves, this is what God has already called me to be fruitful in. And so what has God already said? That's an important question. Second question is, what opportunities do you have? What open doors do you see? God often guides us through opportunities and invitations that we have to serve him. Joseph served in Pharaoh's courts because he was given an open opportunity to rule. Peter visited Cornelius because of a vision. One of the ways that God directs us into fruitfulness is through open doors. Maybe it's an open door in your workplace. Maybe it's just learning to serve in the right moment, to be the right person who's in the right place at the right time. Maybe your open door is in your neighborhood, with your family, or with a close friend. What opportunities do you have? What open doors to fruitfulness are before you? And how are you going to enter in? How are you going to walk through those doors? Third question, what do you want to do? In other words, what would you like to do? And what do you enjoy doing that produces fruit in your life? So often we think being fruitful for God is doing something we hate. That somehow, living a fruitful life should mean selling everything we have, moving to some remote nation and living in poverty to preach the gospel. But the scriptures tell us that God gives us the desires of our hearts. God uses our desires and passions to direct us in his mission in this world. He loves to give us the desire of our hearts. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul longed to visit Rome so that he could preach the gospel there. Our longings matter to God. And so we need to ask ourselves, what issues in our sphere of influence naturally stir our hearts to create a sense of excitement and passion? Because often, when we apply ourselves to those things, we discover fruit. And so have you noticed any particular gaps or needs around you that you have a desire and a sense to want to fulfill? What is it you want to do? And then lastly, what natural gifts do you already have? What natural strengths and gifts do you bring? God often uses our natural abilities to help us serve others, bring life and fruitfulness. Our strengths are the things that we are good at. And maybe you need to take stock. Maybe some of us have this kind of sense of false humility and like, oh, I can't admit that I'm good at doing this thing. And if you can't do that, maybe ask someone else. Hey, what am I good at? Get them to tell you where your gifts are. And then how may you take those gifts and serve others with them? How may you bring fruitfulness where you are through the gifts that you have? You see, the seed that falls on good soil is fruitfulness that produces something. It produces a crop, some 30, some 60, and some 100 times what was sown. Could you imagine taking the things that you're gifted and talented at doing and seeing that multiplied 100 times? Taking the things that you're passionate about and seeing it multiplied in other people, in other spaces. You see, you being fully alive, as we've labored for the last 2 months, means taking your ordinary life and your ordinary self and saying, God, use me and change me. Make me into the person I'm designed to be. Make me into the person you created me to be, someone who is fully alive. Isn't that what we want? That's who we are. And that's the life that we're meant to live. And you see, our task is to cultivate lives where the seed that's sown lands in good soil. And that's why it's important to kind of address things like the way we think. That's why it's important to be people who know how to live in this unhurried existence in a world that is out of control. That's why it's important to be people who understand and know how to care for this thing we call the soul. That's why we need to be rubbing shoulders and doing life with other people. Because we want to cultivate something in our lives where seed can grow and it can reproduce. It can produce a crop in our lives. Amen? Okay, so why don't we stand and we'll quickly pray.